Well, welcome to week 2, video 3 for PSC 355. And in this video, we're going to be talking about industrial policy and protectionism. Now, the central question in this video is actually the same as what we've been asking in all of our other videos, which is what explains government's trade policy choices. However, in this video, we're going to look at a different approach. Instead of the society-centered approach that says government trade policies are reflective of domestic interest groups lobbying for protection or free trade, now we're going to consider how national policymakers may intervene in the economy for reasons independent of domestic interest groups. That is, trade policy may not simply be a reflection of domestic interest group pressure. It may be something that relates to a preference of policymakers independent of those groups. One of the most central concepts that fit within this state-centered approach to trade policy is this concept of infant industry protection. Infant industry protection claims that in some cases, new firms are going to be inefficient and uncompetitive at a very early stage of their development. But over time, they can become efficient and competitive if they're given time and space to develop. This term infant industry is very illustrative of this image of this baby we have down here in the corner, right? You've got to coddle and protect a child to give them time to grow into a strong and independent individual. The same logic applies to industries, says the case for infant industry protection. The idea here is that a temporary tariff or other protection, maybe a subsidy, something that gives that infant industry protection, can be used to insulate those new firms from international competition that could be harmful, that could potentially cause that firm to become uncompetitive and lose its ability to produce goods. So eventually, a firm, if it's protected, is going to be able to compete with those foreign competitors. And in that case, once it develops into an adult, then the tariff can be removed, or the subsidy or what other protection is being provided. Now, the basic idea and position that infant industry protection takes is that the long run welfare gains from this new established industry outweigh the short-term welfare losses from the tariff. Remember, this relates back to this idea that free trade is good for everyone, that it's absolutely beneficial for all states. And so you can say, yes, we agree. Free trade is good for all states, all countries. The economic case is pretty solid there. But in some cases, protectionism is in the long run beneficial for letting this new industry get off the ground, even if there are some short-term costs, which are the fact that you lose the benefits of trade for a temporary period of time. There are two basic reasons why an infant industry might be inefficient in the short term, but efficient in the long term. And that relates to these concepts, economies of scale and economies of experience. We're going to talk about each of these. Economies of scale refers to when the cost of production varies with the size of the output. I'm going to give you an example here. Lockheed Martin, a aeronautics company that produces a lot of fighter jets for the U.S. military and other militaries around the world, is producing now what's called the F-35 fighter jet. This is supposed to be the fighter jet of the future for the United States military. Today, it's not producing very many. It's at the early stages of production, and the cost is between $130 and $160 million per copy. Think about that. Up to $160 million for just one plane. It's incredible. But Lockheed Martin has explained to the Defense Department, who's buying these fighters, that once we get to a production stage of, say, 3,000, and we're producing more of these at once, the scale of the output is increasing, then the cost is going to drop significantly, $65 million per copy, which is, of course, less than half the price of that full price tag. This isn't that different from this concept of, say, buying in bulk, right? If you buy 6 rolls of toilet paper, it costs more per roll of toilet paper than if you buy 24 rolls, right? So as you produce more, as the size of the output increases in certain industries, the cost of production can drop. The other concept here, economies of experience, is related and argues that, or relates to a situation when efficient production requires skills that can only be acquired through the production in that industry. In other words, the only way you can develop the skills necessary to produce a particular product or to produce a certain service, you're only going to develop those skills by actually doing that. An example here is Airbus. You'll read about this in the text. This assembly of Airbus's first jet fuselage required 350,000 person hours to build that fuselage, but over time this fell to about 42,000 person hours. In other words, you learn shortcuts, you learn what not to do, you learn how to become a more efficient producer of a particular good or service. And you only can become efficient over time through experience. So here's the problem from the infant industry protection perspective. New firms in industries that exhibit economies of scale and economies of experience, they face a problem. You cannot produce efficiently enough to export those goods until you achieve economies of scale and economies of experience. In an open economy, you're going to be forced to compete immediately, though, with those foreign firms. And they've already achieved economies of scale and economies of experience. So you can only achieve these things, you can only produce efficiently when you achieve these things, but yet you're not going to be able to compete in an open economy because you're competing against other firms that already have these advantages. And so it's difficult for a new firm to sell its goods. In fact, it's likely to be undersold by those more efficient, lower cost foreign producers. So, if you can't produce enough to reach economies of scale and economies of experience, you're never going to get off the ground. The infant is never going to grow into adulthood unless there is some protection, something to help that infant industry develop in a safe space. By imposing a tariff, making those foreign goods, those foreign competitors' goods more expensive, that's going to essentially deliver that domestic market to the new firm. It's going to say, look, yeah, those foreign products, yes, they've achieved economies of scale and experience, and they are a lower price good, but we're going to impose this fee, and we're going to make them more expensive and actually make this domestically produced good the more attractive option. And those early high cost units are going to be sold within the domestic market, right? You're going to deliver essentially that domestic market to the infant firm. And over time, as that firm begins to produce for that domestic market, it's going to achieve economies of scale and economies of experience. And at that point, you can remove the tariff and it can then compete against the big boys and girls in the global economy. This approach was used throughout history, going back to the 19th century. Germany used an infant industry protection policy to catch up with Great Britain, for instance. South Korea used it in the 1960s to catch up with the United States. It's an example of what's called industrial policy, where a state is going to divert resources toward industries that it wants to promote. Alexander Gerschenkron was an economist who argued that the more backward an economy was, the more interventionist the state needed to be. In other words, if you're a very undeveloped country, the state needs to intervene in the economy to divert resources toward industries, to protect those industries, to give them space to catch up to their competitors. In today's world, we see examples of industrial policy all over the place. China, in particular, uses industrial policy to promote development. In the last decade, it's pumped billions of dollars into what it calls pillar industries. Telecom. We're going to talk in a couple weeks about Huawei, an IT firm, has been assisted greatly by the Chinese government. China has pumped billions into solar, wind, and other green energies. You haven't bought a Chinese car yet, but in 10 or 15 years, you very well might. And these Chinese car makers like Geely Motors are supported by the state. Steel producers also protected and supported by the state in China. Pillar industries where the state intervenes. Now, what about the U.S.? We think of the U.S. as a free trading economy, as a state that doesn't get involved in the economy, that lets markets sort of run the show. Does the U.S. use industrial policy? In a speech in May 2009, shortly after he was elected, President Obama made this statement. He said, "We have to make some strategic decisions about strategic industries." And we have seen in recent years examples of U.S. and state investments and protections, if you will, in certain sectors, in particular in green energy as well. For instance, take a look over here. You can see on this figure here, this shows you the world's top makers of automotive lithium ion batteries. And if you look there, the first one, two, three, four, the top four companies are in Japan, China, and South Korea. The U.S. is fifth ranked. It's Inter1 Incorporated is the fifth ranked company and far, far behind in terms of megawatt hours shipped a few years ago. Now, assuming that electric cars become the dominant mode of transportation in the next couple of decades, producing lithium ion batteries for those cars is going to be a hugely important thing for economies. Now, the United States wants to catch up with these other places. And so what have we seen? Hey, in 2009, $2.4 billion of federal money went to help promote development of the U.S. battery industry. This is arguably a protection. It gives those firms a competitive advantage that they wouldn't have were it not for the state intervening. If we look at overall investment in clean energy, China leads by far over other countries, but the United States is number two. The state in the U.S. has invested greatly in green energy projects. In fact, $2.3 billion of a 2010 U.S. energy program was invested in 183 different clean energy firms. And we've even seen the United States pursuing complaints against China in the World Trade Organization, which we talked about last week, taking China to the dispute settlement mechanism to try and get China to remove some of its protections of its solar industry and its wind industry, because the U.S. again is so concerned about promoting its competitive industries in these strategic sectors. So the bottom line here, protectionist policies don't necessarily always reflect societal interests. In these examples we gave, industrial policy may just reflect the desire of the state to promote the development of certain strategic industries. In your text, you're going to read about Airbus and how the European Union felt that it was important to have a foothold in the long-range commercial airline industry. The next video you'll watch this week is a short clip from a documentary that helps to add some more historical detail to the case of Airbus. And you're going to see how the European Union was initially behind. It didn't have the economies of scale and experience to catch up to Boeing, the US corporation. And at the very end of the clip, you'll see how the European Union countries came together, worked together to promote the development of a European competitor. And that story is not about societal interests. It's about state strategic interests to protect a certain sector to become competitive.